Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty huge, a really radical thesis from our sources.
Yeah.
The core idea is that our modern financial system, the way money works today, is actually actively, well, rigging the game against civilization itself.
That's right. It's a strong claim. The sources argue that fiat currency, the money government's issue that isn't backed by gold or anything physical, isn't just inefficient. They say it's a fundamental driver of decay. Moral, personal, societal decay.
Yeah, and for you listening, maybe looking for that crucial insight without wading through dense texts, our mission today is pretty clear. We're diving deep. We want to pull out the 10 core lessons from this analysis, really detail how this system is, according to them, messing things up, from the stuff you buy every day to, like, the integrity of big global institutions.
And crucially, we'll also explore the solution they propose, the countermeasure, which they argue is Bitcoin.
Okay, so the starting point is aggressive. It's immediate, and it feels really personal. It suggests that feeling like you're always struggling, always running to stand still financially, that's maybe not just on you, it's built into the system. The core problem, as they define it, is blunt. The sources just come right out and say, you are being stolen from.
Absolutely. And it's not just, prices are going up. It goes deeper. They argue fiat inflation causes this net reduction in overall productivity. It works like a tax nobody voted for, a stealth tax, and it's an active theft, really, of the wealth people have managed to save up.
So this decay, they're saying you can actually see it, like in everyday life.
Yeah, that's the claim. It's tangible. You're working longer hours, right? But what can you actually buy with that money? Probably less than before. Look at food quality. They argue it's deteriorating. Communities feel, more impersonal, less connected. You're basically running faster just to stay in the same place, financially speaking, year after year.
Okay, so if the symptoms are everywhere, smaller families maybe, products that break down faster, politics getting uglier, what's the root cause? What's the diagnosis here?
Monetary corruption. Plain and simple. According to these sources. They call money the lifeblood of civilization, which makes sense, right? When money is stable, hard, difficult to just print out of nowhere, what they call sound money, it encourages thinking long-term, honest trade, building things that last, prosperity.
But that's not what we have now.
Exactly. When central banks get a monopoly on creating money and they start debasing it, printing more and more, that whole intricate network of relationships, of trade, of trust, it starts to fray. Trust just evaporates. People stop planning for the long haul. Our collective ability to build stable institutions, it just kind of collapses. The value flowing through society isn't stable anymore. And that fragility, that's what we feel is the systemic decline.
Wow, that sets a heavy stage. Okay, we need to unpack this systematically. We'll follow the structure the source material uses, starting with how fiat hits you, the individual. Then we'll broaden out to organizations, institutions, then nations, the global picture, and finally, what they see as the cure.
Right. So let's start with the foundation. Lesson 1, we'll call it. Fiat undermines civilization through this hidden tax.
Okay, theft. We need to be clear about how this theft actually works. It's not like a bank robbery, right? It's ongoing.
It's systematic, yeah. Relentless erosion. The sources describe it as the direct result of central planning and this monopolistic control by central banks. It just makes it increasingly difficult to make ends meet for most people.
And why is it so difficult? What's the mechanism?
Well, it's kind of a double hit from fiat. First, the obvious one. Inflation steals the value of your savings. If you hold dollars or euros or whatever, the central bank printing more just taxes away your purchasing power, silently. But second, and this is maybe even more damaging to civilization according to the sources, this debasement actually inhibits our ability to create new wealth.
How does it do that?
Because inflation messes up all the price signals in the economy, resources get misallocated, bad investments look good temporarily, good long-term projects get starved of capital. It causes this net reduction in actual productivity across the board. So it's a double whammy. The money you have is losing value, and it's simultaneously harder to earn new money, honestly, because the whole system of incentives for producing real value is broken.
That makes saving feel almost pointless. Like you said, trying to fill a bucket, but the central bank keeps punching holes in it. You pour more work in, but it just leaks out.
You nailed it. That's the analogy. And you see the results everywhere, beyond just, the price of groceries, product quality drops. Why? Because manufacturers have to cut corners, use cheaper materials just to keep their profit margins stable when the currency itself is sinking. Institutions, governments, big companies, they become unstable. They lose focus. They get hyper-political because the real game isn't delivering value anymore. It's getting access to the money printer, cozying up to the source of funds.
And even our big collective goals seem to shrink.
Yeah, the sources argue ambition itself gets debased. Where are the huge multi-decade infrastructure projects, the serious push for space exploration? They get replaced by what the sources call dull and self-absorbed aspirations, mostly just focused on immediate consumption, keeping up appearances.
Okay, that leads perfectly into the next idea, moving from pure economics to, psychology. Lesson 2. Fiat steals dreams and replaces meaning. This gets into something called time preference.
Right. High time preference. It's basically that urge for instant gratification, wanting things now instead of planning and sacrificing for something better later, like choosing a sugary snack over a healthy meal, but applied to everything. Fiat money, because it guarantees your savings will lose value over time, is like the perfect fuel for this high time preference behavior. Why would you bust your gut for 50 years building a family legacy, a sustainable business, a lasting piece of art,
when the money you'd store that value in is designed to appreciate?
Exactly. When the unit of account itself is programmed to melt away, maybe around 7% per year on average, historically speaking with the dollar, the incentive flips.
So the money itself sends a signal that changes the whole culture. If the signal is spend now, borrow cheap, people stop acting like you're building for the future and start acting like, just consumers living for today.
It's a rational response to, frankly, an irrational signal from the money. And the sources argue this corrodes the things that traditionally gave life meaning, deep family commitments, strong communities, maybe religious faith, the satisfaction of productive work. These get debased, pushed aside, and replaced by what the sources call parasites.
Parasites, like what?
Things like fiat education focus more on getting the right credentials than actual learning. Fiat companies, businesses that only survive because they can borrow endless cheap money, not because they're actually good. Fiat politics promising easy solutions and free stuff, funded by the printer. They're described as shallow substitutes, designed to keep you busy, distracted, consuming, and ultimately dependent on the system.
And the state actively pushes this sort of shallow alternative.
Yeah, the argument is the state promotes this kind of false utopia, a narrative built on dependency. Instead of focusing on genuinely ambitious, productive goals like, say, actually getting humans to Mars, the story becomes about clinging to this hedonistic lifestyle managed by the state, comfort without hard work, rights without responsibilities.
And how does this hit you, the listener, directly?
Well, you're constantly bombarded with messages pushing that high time preference. Think about it. The sources ask, are you more worried about long-term spiritual or personal growth? Or is it more about how do I get abs like that influencer? Or how can I afford the next flashy thing? Because saving is so difficult, planning for the really long-term genuine financial independence, building something that lasts for generations, it starts to feel like a total pipe dream. The whole game shifts to just grabbing quick wins, consuming to signal status, not actually producing lasting value.
It seems inevitable that if the economic foundation rewards short-term thinking and devalues sacrifice, our ideas about right and wrong would shift too, which takes us straight to lesson 3.
Yeah.
Fiat debases morality.
Yeah, this is where they introduce the concept of fiat morality. It's described as this set of values that's constantly changing, imposed from the top down by elites. Unlike traditional morality, the basic intuitive rules like don't steal, don't cheat, which are pretty stable fiat morality shifts with the political winds, whatever the powerful deem acceptable today.
Can you give some examples they use?
They point to things that seem to come out of nowhere and demand immediate compliance. Things like specific mask mandates during the pandemic, insistence on particular pronouns, or even promoting ideas like eating insects or being happy owning nothing. The point isn't whether these specific things are good or bad, but that they represent values dictated from above, demanding conformity, often very suddenly.
It sounds like a system designed to keep everyone guessing, constantly looking over their shoulder for approval from whoever's in charge.
Exactly. It's about enforcing compliance. Fiat morality gets spread through powerful channels, the media, universities, government pronouncements. They tend to act in unison. And because humans have this natural tendency to conform, if enough influential voices say something is virtuous or evil, the pressure to go along becomes immense. They talk about creating these bright red lines of acceptable thought and behavior. Step over them and you risk your job, your social standing, maybe even access to financial services.
And the reward for staying inside those lines, that's what they call virtue signaling. But it's not about actual virtue.
Right. It's about demonstrating compliance. It's a public display that you accept the current narrative, that you're on the right team. That enthusiastic, unquestioning support signals to the elites, to the people benefiting from the system, that you're trustworthy, that you can be given access to the good jobs, the prestigious positions, the ones that are ultimately funded by that same money printer. It's the entry ticket into the rent-seeking class, which we'll get to.
So it's a performance to gain access.
Basically, yes. And they contrast this starkly with what they call natural law or traditional morality. Those intuitive common sense rules: don't harm others, honor your agreements, tell the truth, which form the basis of actual justice, and don't just change because a politician says so.
Okay, if the core economic reality is this guaranteed systemic theft through inflation, maybe the system naturally selects for people who are okay with that, or even benefit from it. That leads us to lesson 4, the hard numbers. The fiat treadmill and the lack of savings vehicles.
Yeah, this grounds that high time preference behavior in the cold, hard facts of monetary policy. Fiat money is just terrible as a store of value. Why?
Yeah.
Because the supply keeps expanding relentlessly. The sources give a figure that's honestly staggering. The M2 money supply, which is a pretty broad measure of money floating around in the U.S. economy, went from about $289 billion in 1959 to over $21 trillion by 2023.
It's hard to even get your head around that scale of expansion. What does that mean for an ordinary person just trying to put some money aside?
Well, do the math. If you annualize that growth over 60-something years, it comes out to an average debasement, an average loss of purchasing power of roughly 7% every single year. That's the grim reality. That's the benchmark. If your savings account, your basic investment fund, whatever, if it's yielding less than 7% a year, you are actively getting poorer. Your money is losing value relative to the total amount of money out there.
So it forces you onto this treadmill.
Exactly. The fiat treadmill. You're forced to constantly invest, constantly seek higher returns, maybe take on more risk, just to try and keep pace with the government diluting the currency. Financial life shifts from building wealth slowly and securely to this desperate scramble just to tread water. You're investing defensively, not proactively building.
Okay, but what about things like stocks or real estate or gold?
Yeah.
Don't those usually keep up with inflation or beat it?
Well, yes and no. They can keep pace, but the sources argue they all have significant problems, especially for the average person. Gold. It sounds great, but in practice, you're often dealing with paper certificates. Banks might only hold a fraction of the gold they claim to have, and prices can be manipulated. It's not always the solid store of value people think, especially in liquid markets. Stocks. You need to constantly research, pick winners, and you face what they call moral hazard as the company's CEO focused on creating value or just playing political games to get subsidies. You're betting on management you can't really control. And real estate, sure, it's tangible, but it's incredibly illiquid. Selling a house takes time, costs a fortune in commissions, easily 5% or more, plus property taxes every year. And then there's the ultimate risk. The government can just take it through eminent domain.
Right. And if you actually want to get ahead, to significantly beat that 7% benchmark and actually grow your wealth?
Well, that's where the game gets really skewed towards the already wealthy. The assets that generate those huge market-beating returns, think luxury real estate in London or New York, shares in tech companies before they go public, exclusive hedge fund deals, those are almost entirely off-limits to regular people. Those opportunities flow to the people who benefit most from the Cantillon Effect, the ones getting the new money first. We'll discuss that next.
So for the average person, trying to beat 7% means?
It means taking huge risks. Gambling, essentially, chasing the next hot stock tip, the next crypto fad, the next housing bubble. It breeds this deep resentment, too, because success often feels like pure luck or being connected rather than skill or hard work. The ultimate incentive, sadly, becomes trying to work as little as possible while consuming as much as possible, fueled by easy credit and the need to constantly signal status through visible spending.
Okay, that paints a pretty bleak picture of how fiat impacts personal life and incentives. Let's broaden the view now. How does this corrosive effect spread outwards? Starting with lesson 5. Fiat creates a nation of rent seekers.
Right. So first, what's a rent seeker? In this context, as defined by the sources, it's someone or a company or an institution that makes money by manipulating the system, often at others' expense, without actually creating any new value for the market. Think of lobbyists pushing for regulations that hurt their competitors but help them, or government bureaucrats creating endless red tape that justifies their own jobs, or even investment bankers taking huge bets with other people's money, knowing the government might bail them out. Fiat money, the sources argue, is the great enabler of this.
Why does fiat specifically push talented people towards this, rent-seeking, instead of, say, starting a business or inventing something?
Because it completely warps the incentive structure. The sources are blunt. The most talented, ambitious people get drawn away from the hard, uncertain work of actually producing useful goods and services. Why? Because rent-seeking, navigating the bureaucracy, playing politics, getting subsidies, manipulating regulations becomes more lucrative, require less effort and creativity, and provide greater certainty thanks to those political connections. If you can make more money more easily by lobbying than by innovating, well, guess what people do?
And this distortion gets supercharged by something you mentioned earlier, the Cantillon Effect. Can we break that down a bit more?
Absolutely. It's crucial. The Cantillon Effect basically describes how new money, when it's printed by the central bank, doesn't just appear magically in everyone's bank account equally. It enters the economy at specific points, usually through big banks lending it out, or government spending on contractors, or big corporations getting bailouts or subsidies. These first receivers get a massive advantage.
How so?
They get to spend that new money before it has circulated widely and cause prices to rise everywhere else. So they can buy up assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, art at the old lower prices. This demand pushes asset prices up, making them richer on paper instantly.
Okay, so they get the benefit up front. And by the time that money eventually trickles down to, say, an average worker in the form of a small pay raise.
Exactly. By then, the prices of everything they need to buy food, rent, energy have already gone up because all that new money is sloshing around, so their raise gets eaten up by inflation. Effectively, wealth has been transferred from the later receivers, the average people, to the first receivers, the politically connected. It's a hidden transfer payment.
Which means the whole economy starts revolving around politics, not merit.
Precisely. Companies that are good at lobbying, good at playing the political game, they thrive, even if their product is terrible. They get the government contracts, they get the bailouts, they get regulations written in their favor. Meanwhile, genuine innovators, small businesses trying to compete on merit, they get crushed. The incumbents use their political clout, think massive regulatory hurdles that only they can afford to comply with, or endless cheap debt to buy out competitors to maintain the status quo, to suffocate real progress.
And this leads to stagnation. The sources talk about corporate zombies.
Yeah. Corporate zombies. These are companies that, in a healthy market with sound money, probably would have gone bankrupt years ago. They're inefficient, they're not innovating, but they survive. Why? Purely because they have access to that fire hose of cheap fiat credit, often backed by implicit government guarantees. And they're protected from real competition by those regulatory moats. They just lumber along, consuming resources, blocking progress. This is why, the sources argue, we see stagnation or even regression in many physical world sectors. Airplanes aren't faster than 50 years ago. They're slower. Your dishwasher takes 3 hours now, not 1. Resources get locked up, propping up these politically favored zombies instead of flowing to dynamic new ventures.
Wow. Okay, the corruption of economic incentives is clear. But the sources go even further into the most fundamental unit of society, the family. Lesson 6 is pretty startling. Fiat debases marriage, families, and relationships.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the most provocative parts of the analysis. They're drawing a direct line from monetary policy to deep social changes. It starts with the idea of love itself. Under a fiat system with its high time preference, the argument goes that love gets reduced from something demanding, a virtue requiring sacrifice, discipline, commitment. It gets watered down to just expressing fleeting emotions, like saying, I love ice cream. Commitment becomes less important than immediate feelings.
And they argue the state's financial power actually enabled legal changes that fundamentally altered marriage.
Correct. The analysis points squarely at the widespread adoption of no-fault divorce, which really took off starting around 1969 in California and then spread. This, combined with the massive expansion of government welfare programs and safety nets, all made possible because the government could just print the money to pay for them.
Okay, I need to pause you there. That's a huge claim. How exactly do the sources connect fiat money specifically to those legal and social shifts like no-fault divorce?
The argument is about substitution. They claim that the state, flush with fiat cash, was able to position itself as a substitute for the traditional economic and social safety net provided by a strong family unit. If the state promises to step in with welfare checks, child support enforcement, housing assistance, all funded by the money printer, then the perceived necessity for the family to provide that lifelong stability and mutual support weakens. No-fault divorce meant one person could dissolve the marriage for any reason or no reason without the other's consent and often without penalty for breaking vows. The sources argue this turned marriage from a binding commitment into essentially an easily breakable contract based purely on maintaining individual happiness at all times. The legal and then the moral weight of the commitment just eroded. They go so far as to say legally all fiat marriages become open marriages because the contract is so easily voided by one party.
And the sources claim the fallout from this hit the most vulnerable communities hardest.
Yes, the statistics they cite are pretty stark, focusing particularly on the impact on the poor. They specifically highlight the dramatic changes in Black family structures in the U.S. They point out that in 1950, a higher percentage of Black women were married by age 35 than white women, indicating strong family structures. But this trend reversed dramatically in the following decades. The argument is that the combination of easily accessible divorce and state welfare programs disproportionately disrupted these communities, substituting reliable family bonds with dependence on government programs.
Which could also connect to falling birth rates globally. If the state provides the safety net, maybe people see less need for the traditional family structure, trading those intimate family bonds for, as the sources put it, rent-seeking political connections to government aid.
Precisely. That's the connection they make. And they even contextualize it with ideologies like the Frankfurt School Marxist thinkers, who explicitly aimed to replace the family, which they saw as a source of false consciousness, with dependence on the state to achieve class consciousness, or what might today be called being woke. Under fiat, having children can start to look less like building a family legacy and more like an immediate financial burden that drains your already depreciating resources.
And just in everyday relationships, beyond marriage, does fiat mess those up too?
Yeah, the high time preference bleeds into everything. If money is easy to get, or seems easy via debt, and trust is low, exploitation becomes the rational strategy. Think about the explosion in scams, pyramid schemes, multi-level marketing. Why build a reputation for honest dealing over years if you can make a quick buck now and disappear? Reputation matters less when your ultimate backstop feels like the government's money printer, not satisfied customers. Relationships become more transactional. People focus on what they can get immediately, convenience, fun, status, rather than investing in loyalty, character, building something solid. If a relationship requires effort, sacrifice, discipline, it's easier just to move on to the next, seemingly easier option.
Okay, moving from personal relationships up to larger organizations. Lesson 7. Fiat corrupts organizations. They look at corporations, universities, even charities.
Right. In the corporate world, fiat money is like a life support machine for bloated inefficiency. Remember the Cantillon Effect. Big companies get first dibs on cheap loans. This fire hose of cheap money lets them paper over the massive costs and sluggishness that come with being huge layers of management, bureaucracy, difficulty changing direction. It allows these soulless, zombie-like entities, as the sources call them, to survive long after a competitive market would have killed them. Their main goal shifts from serving customers to pleasing the sources of funding banks and government.
And the tech giants, Google, Facebook, etc., are seen as a prime example of this.
Yeah, they call it the free service scam. They look like innovators, but their whole business model, according to this analysis, relies on burning through mountains of cheap fiat capital. They attract billions of users with free services, then harvest massive amounts of data and make their money selling your attention to advertisers. This model requires huge upfront investment and tolerating years of losses, which would be almost impossible under a sound money system where capital is scarce and demands real returns quickly. Because they're fueled by this endless fiat funding, they grow into these massive oligarchies, acting like dictators over information, censoring content, controlling the digital public square.
And universities. They're supposed to be about truth and learning, but the sources call them a scam. How so?
The argument is that modern universities have largely stopped selling intellectual growth. Instead, they're selling an experience, an upper-class lifestyle, and a credential, all financed by massive amounts of debt. The curriculum, they argue, shifts away from deep critical thinking and knowledge creation towards teaching rent-seeking skills. How to navigate bureaucracy, how to network politically, how to parrot the currently acceptable narratives to get ahead in a fiat-dominated world.
And the key mechanism is student loans.
Yes, specifically the fact that in many places, like the U.S., student loan debt is incredibly hard, sometimes impossible, to discharge through bankruptcy. This creates what the sources brutally call NPC zombies, graduates, burdened by inescapable debt. This debt burden makes them financially precarious and, arguably, more likely to vote for politicians promising debt forgiveness or relief, regardless of the broader economic consequences. It's seen as a system that exploits young people and the middle class to funnel money into bloated, inefficient, but politically connected academic institutions.
Finally, even charity gets corrupted. How does fiat mess up something that seems inherently good?
It makes it impersonal and performs a different function. Instead of charity requiring your actual time, your effort, your direct involvement, which is, traditional charity fiat, allows it to become mostly about writing checks. For the very wealthy, especially those who benefited hugely from the Cantillon Effect, large public donations become a form of reputation repair, a way to launder the image after profiting from a system that harms others. And the charities themselves. They often end up with warped incentives. Many become heavily reliant on government grants, which means they have to comply with political agendas. They become bureaucratic, focused on fundraising and administration rather than maximizing impact. Accountability suffers. True charity needs scrutiny and sacrifice, but fiat makes it easy to just throw money at problems, tick a box for social credit, and feel good without demanding real results.
We've seen the decay spread from individuals to relationships to big organizations. Now we scale up again to the level of the nation-state itself. Lesson 8. Fiat corrupts the state and politicizes everything. Having the power to print money seems like the ultimate political cheat code.
It absolutely is, according to these sources. They argue it's the root of basically all modern political dysfunction. Why? Because fiat money lets governments dodge the hard choices they'd have to make under sound money. Things like raising taxes directly, which is unpopular, or making real cuts to spending, which is also unpopular. Instead, they can just fund their promises, their wars, their pet projects, their political favors by borrowing money they know the central bank will effectively print to cover. It's deficit spending made easy, using inflation, that hidden tax, to pay the bills, is how they stay in power, kicking the can down the road.
So if the government can just print money, why bother with explicit taxes at all? Income tax, sales tax? The sources call it revenue theater. What's the point of the performance?
It's a great question, and the argument is that explicit taxes in a fiat system serve purposes other than actually funding the government. They list three main functions. First, taxes help manage appearances around things like debt ceilings. It creates political drama and makes it look like there are constraints. Second, taxes help mask the Cantillon Effect. By making a big show of taxing the rich, even if the rich get far richer from asset inflation caused by printing, it hides the reality that inflation is the main way wealth is transferred upwards. And third, maybe most importantly, explicit taxes are needed to hide the fundamental injustice of inflation itself. If the government just abolished all income tax tomorrow and paid for everything by printing, the sheer scale of the hidden confiscation would become blindingly obvious. People might revolt. So, taxes create a necessary illusion of fairness and fiscal responsibility.
And this power to fund things endlessly allows the government to seep into every corner of the economy. This idea of financialization.
Exactly. Financialization means industry becomes subservient to the state and the financial sector rather than the other way around. Businesses learn that survival and profit depend less on pleasing customers and more on pleasing politicians and bankers to get access to that cheap fiat capital. Companies that take government subsidies or bailouts inevitably find themselves pressured to align with political goals. Think about pushes for ESG, environmental, social governance criteria, or DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. The sources argue that whether these goals are good or bad isn't the point. The point is that businesses are forced to adopt them not for market reasons, but for political ones. Taking the king's coin, as they put it, turns you into a deputy of the state. You start enforcing the government's agenda, maybe by censoring users or adopting inefficient green policies that aren't actually economical.
And this leads to a kind of tyranny through complexity, where the laws are so vast, no one can comply.
Right. When you have literally millions of pages of laws and regulations, no one can be in 100% compliance. It's impossible. But this complexity isn't just an accident, it's a source of immense power for regulators. It means they can choose to go after any business they don't like for any political reason. They can always find some violation, some nitpicky rule that wasn't followed perfectly. It effectively gives bureaucrats the power to hold a death sentence over any company, allowing them to pick winners and losers based on political favor rather than market success.
This corruption even extends to something as seemingly solid as owning a home. The sources call real estate a fiat possession. What does that mean?
It means your ownership isn't as secure as you think, and its value is heavily manipulated by the fiat system. Governments want real estate prices to go up. Why? It's easy to tax. for one. And rising house prices give citizens this illusion of wealth, makes them feel secure, pacifies them, even as their currency is being debased. The whole bubble is deliberately inflated using government-backed mortgages and preferential tax treatment, like mortgage interest deductions.
But wait, how is ownership an illusion? I have a deed.
Sure, but how strong is that deed? Property rights get seriously weakened in a fiat system. First, there's the constant drain of property taxes, which implies you're renting your property from the state. But the bigger issue they highlight is the abuse of eminent domain.
Right, eminent domain. That's when the government takes your land for, like, a highway or a school, public use.
That's the textbook definition. But the sources argue it's routinely abused under fiat for so-called economic development, which often means the government forcibly takes land from one private owner, maybe a family home, maybe a small business, and hands it over to another politically connected private developer. Someone who promises to build a shopping mall or luxury condos or a factory that politicians like. It becomes a tool for transferring wealth from the politically weak to the politically powerful, all justified by vague promises of jobs or tax revenue, and often financed with more subsidized fiat debt.
And the housing bubble itself, the generally rising prices, that's baked into how banking works now.
Absolutely. For banks, issuing mortgages in a fiat system is almost a risk-free gravy train. Often these mortgages are quickly bundled up and sold off or guaranteed by government-sponsored entities like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the U.S. Crucially, banks don't actually need existing deposits to make these loans. When they issue a mortgage, they essentially create new money out of thin air, backed by the property. There's very little opportunity cost for the bank, just the risk of default, which is often insured or passed on. This creates a virtually unlimited supply of cheap credit chasing a limited supply of desirable housing, inevitably driving prices sky high. The ratio of average house costs to average income has exploded. They cite figures like going from maybe 4-to-1 in the 70s to over 8-to-1 recently in many places. People aren't buying homes just for shelter anymore. They're forced to buy them as lifeboats for escaping inflation.
Okay, finally we reach lesson 9. Fiat ruins science, art, and health. It seems like nothing is untouched by this debasement of value.
It really permeates everything, according to this analysis. Let's start with fiat science. This is science driven more by hype cycles and chasing government grants than by actual pursuit of truth or market viability. It promotes massive investment in technologies that always seem to be just 20 years away. Think certain types of nanotech, practical quantum computing, cold fusion. These projects become magnets for funding, often regardless of real progress, because they sound impressive and justify large budgets. They can be hard to distinguish from elaborate scams designed just to keep the grant money flowing.
So scientific careers themselves become a form of rent-seeking.
That's the argument. Academics find themselves incentivized to churn out papers in obscure, highly specialized fields, often using complex models that are difficult or impossible to test empirically. They mention string theory as a possible example in physics. The goal becomes publication count and securing funding from centralized authorities, not necessarily making verifiable discoveries. Fiat science, they say, ends up looking like vaporware, lots of promises, fancy websites, but the product never actually ships. It runs on banked reputation and grant proposals, not results.
And this distortion hits energy policy, too, something absolutely critical for civilization.
Hugely critical. The sources argue fiat money actively debases our energy systems. How? By demonizing reliable, high-density energy sources like fossil fuels, the very things that powered industrial civilization and lifted billions out of poverty. Meanwhile, unreliable, variable, and often energy-poor alternatives like wind and solar get massively subsidized. Why? Not because they're scientifically superior for baseline power, but because they are politically popular and benefit-connected investors. They call it altcoin energy, a speculative asset class driven by politics, not physics or economics.
And restricting reliable energy has real consequences, right? It's not just abstract.
Absolutely. It directly devalues human labor. Since around 1971, coinciding with the end of the gold standard, increasing restrictions on abundant energy have hampered the energy multiplier effect, the way cheap energy amplifies what a human can produce. They give examples like electric airplanes being limited to maybe a 30-mile range because batteries are just too heavy and energy poor compared to jet fuel. It represents stagnation, even regression, driven by government picking winners and losers based on political fashion, not scientific reality. And when developed nations push unreliable wind and solar onto developing countries, the sources call that a deliberate drag on growth, a form of continued economic imperialism.
Okay, shifting to culture. How does fiat turn art into a joke?
Fiat art. It becomes detached from skill, beauty, or any connection to objective reality. Think of the examples that make headlines. A banana duct taped to a wall selling for a fortune, or a canvas painted entirely one color. The value isn't inherent, it's decreed. By whom? By a small circle of elite critics, curators, and gallerists who the sources bluntly label scammers. Art becomes centralized. Its value depends entirely on the approval of these authorized issuers, just like fiat money itself. The public is told what to value, rather than trusting their own eyes or judgment.
And finally, this reliance on authority debases knowledge itself.
Yes, because it exploits our natural tendency to conform. Think of the classic Asch conformity experiments, where people denied their own senses just to agree with the group. When knowledge becomes highly specialized and complex, especially in areas like finance or central banking, it's easy for authorities to create an environment where people feel they have to trust the experts. They can't possibly verify things themselves. This allows those designated experts, who often benefit from the existing fiat system, to manipulate public understanding. Knowledge becomes less about discovering reality and more about disseminating propaganda that reinforces the status quo and the rent-seeking positions of those in charge.
Wow. That has been, well, a truly comprehensive and, frankly, quite devastating diagnosis of decay across pretty much every aspect of modern life. So if fiat money is presented as the root cause of all these interconnected problems, what's the proposed way out? We finally arrive at lesson 10. Bitcoin solves everything, reversing the decline.
Right. The hope presented in these sources is anchored entirely in the principles of sound money. Bitcoin, by its very nature being hard, absolutely scarce, with a supply schedule that cannot be changed by politicians or bankers, fundamentally fixes the broken incentives of fiat. By removing the ability to arbitrarily debase the currency, it forces everyone back towards a lower time preference. It allows natural market forces, merit, and long-term thinking to triumph over short-term political manipulation.
Okay, let's focus on that individual transformation first. You mentioned lower time preference. What does that actually look like for someone who adopts this mindset, maybe through Bitcoin?
It means they start thinking long-term again. It encourages saving, planning for the distant future, taking personal responsibility seriously. The sources actually observe trends among early Bitcoin adopters. They become noted for really scrutinizing their health, their diets, famously giving up things like processed foods, seed oils, excessive sugar, because they're investing in their long-term physical well-being. They also note a tendency towards strengthening family ties, getting married, starting families, focusing on commitment and responsibility. These are the traditional virtues that fiat, with its high time preference, tended to erode. The whole mindset shifts from consume now, worry later, to build and save for a better future.
And how does that individual shift ripple outwards into the broader economy?
It fundamentally changes how capital works. Under a Bitcoin standard, or any truly sound money system, saving becomes rational again. Capital becomes genuinely scarce because it represents real accumulated productivity, not just digits created by a bank. This means loans become more expensive. They carry a real opportunity cost. This naturally dampens purely speculative investment, the gambling-like behavior we see under fiat. Assets like real estate or art would likely be valued more for their actual utility, providing shelter, providing aesthetic pleasure, rather than primarily serving as inflation hedges, as lifeboats. This should lead to more realistic pricing and discourage the kind of debt-fueled, conspicuous consumption that defines the fiat era. Businesses would need sounder models based on actual profitability, not just access to cheap debt.
So the economy gets reoriented, away from rent-seeking, back towards actual production and innovation.
That's the core argument. Those corporate zombies we talked about, the ones kept alive only by cheap fiat loans and political protection, they would finally be allowed to fail. Which sounds harsh, but it's actually a necessary cleansing process for a healthy economy. It frees up capital, frees up talent. That capital and talent would then naturally flow towards entrepreneurs and innovators who are actually solving real problems, meeting real market demands. Rent-seeking jobs, lobbying, navigating bureaucracy would become much less attractive compared to the rewards of genuine value creation in a system where merit, not political connection, is the primary driver of success.
And what about the global picture? How does something like Bitcoin end what the sources call monetary imperialism and reduce global fragility?
Well, much of the current global financial fragility, recurring debt crises, wars funded on credit, supply chains optimized solely for cost-cutting at the expense of resilience stems from the dominance of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. This gives the U.S. government enormous power to finance itself and exert influence globally through monetary policy. Bitcoin, being decentralized, having no issuer, no central authority, removes that single point of control and failure. It offers a neutral settlement layer. Countries could no longer rely on political alignment with the issuer of the reserve currency for economic advantage. They'd be forced to compete based on their own internal productivity, their fiscal responsibility, their ability to create attractive environments for capital and citizens. It fosters a more level playing field, a more merit-based international order.
What really stands out for this whole analysis is the sheer scope of the argument, the way it connects dots that most people probably never link, tying everything from, your personal debt and maybe family stress, all the way up to corporate corruption, stagnant science, even the quality of art, tracing it all back to the fundamental nature of the money itself. It makes the case for sound money feel less like just an economic debate and more like, well, a moral imperative, a civilizational one.
I think that's exactly the intention of the source material. The core message running through it all is that fiat money isn't just a neutral tool. It's fundamentally, they argue, a system of trickery and hidden violence. It actively engineers high time preference, it corrodes integrity, it breeds stagnation and dependence. And the conclusion they draw is stark. The only real solution lies in recognizing that you can choose to opt out of this system, that the path towards a healthier future requires reclaiming self-sovereignty, taking personal responsibility, and returning to valuing things that actually last, which are all virtues fundamentally incompatible with a currency designed to decay.
Which brings us right to that final, uncompromising thought we need to leave our listeners with, directly reflecting the ultimate conclusion of this material.
Yes, the message is unambiguous. It's intended as a wake-up call, a call to action. Fiat delenda est. Fiat money must be destroyed. The sources argue that if it isn't, civilization in any meaningful sense simply won't survive. The journey towards a future built on truth, on merit, on lasting value. It starts with you, with your personal decision to question the system, to verify instead of just trusting, and to take control of your own wealth and, ultimately, your own life.
A powerful, provocative call for personal responsibility and nothing less than a complete paradigm shift. Thank you for walking us through this really challenging but absolutely vital deep dive today.
It was fascinating to explore. Thanks for having me.
Farewell.